I don't regret saving my husband's life, even though doing so has risked mine. Now they may execute me. But up until the moment they do, if that does happen, I know I did the right thing. And I do not regret that.
Picture this, May 10th, 2002. Inside Alabama's infamous execution chamber, a 54-year-old grandmother waits in an electric chair called Yellow Mama. She's the first woman Alabama will execute in 45 years, and she'll become the last person ever to die in this particular chair. But here's what makes this story different from every other execution you've heard about. This wasn't a woman who grew up in poverty, or struggled with addiction, or fell into a life of crime through desperation. This was a former Cub Scout mom, a library volunteer, a woman who once baked cookies for school fundraisers and helped kids with their homework. So, what happened? How does someone go from volunteering at the local library to becoming one of the most controversial death row inmates in Alabama history? But here's the part that will leave you speechless. The real twist in this story isn't just what she did. It's what she believed gave her the right to do it. Today, I'm exposing the twisted story of Lynda Block, including the bizarre details about her 80-year-old husband, why she screamed about Waco when police surrounded her, and those bone-chilling final moments when she refused to speak even as electricity was about to cook her alive. This woman went from saving lives to taking them, and died believing she was the hero.
I don't regret it. I do regret that I had to take a life, and that bothers me a lot. But I don't regret that I defended my husband.
Orlando, Florida, 1958. A 10-year-old girl named Lynda Lyon watches her father collapse from a heart attack. He dies right there, leaving her and her younger sister with a mother who, according to Lynda, turned grief into rage. She later claimed her mother beat her, screamed at her, made her feel worthless. Whether that's true or not, something broke inside that little girl. And maybe that's where this whole story really begins, with a child who learned early that the world could be cruel and unpredictable. But here's the fascinating part. Instead of becoming cruel herself, young Lynda did the opposite. She became obsessed with protecting the vulnerable. By the 1980s in Key West, you'd find her at the Humane Society, not just volunteering, but running investigations into animal cruelty. When someone reported a starving dog chained in a backyard or cats being tortured, Lynda was the one who showed up. She was the one who pressed charges. She couldn't save her father, couldn't fix her mother, but she could save these animals. Her second husband, George Sibley, would later describe her constant need to help others as almost compulsive. She wasn't satisfied with just the Humane Society work. For 2 years, she served as president of the Friends of the Library, organizing book sales and literacy programs. She threw herself into a mayoral campaign as publicity director. Every single day, she woke up trying to make Key West a better place. Neighbors knew her, kids loved her. She was that woman you'd trust to watch your pets when you went on vacation. Now remember when I mentioned something shocking about her marriage? Here it is. In 1991, at age 43, Lynda married Carl Block. Carl was 80 years old. Let that sink in for a second. This wasn't some gold digger situation either. Carl was a grieving military veteran who'd just lost his son in a car crash. Maybe Lynda saw another broken soul who needed saving. Maybe Carl saw a younger woman who could ease his loneliness. Whatever drew them together, the marriage lasted less than a year before imploding spectacularly, but we'll get to that violence later. Around this same time, something darker was growing inside Lynda. She started publishing a small magazine called Liberatus, and the articles she wrote should have been a warning sign to everyone around her. One piece titled, "The Day Our Country Was Stolen," argued that the government had been illegitimate since the Civil War. She wrote that birth certificates were actually contracts that sold babies to the state, driver's licenses, secret agreements that gave the government ownership of your body. This wasn't just skepticism about politics. This was full-blown paranoia dressed up as patriotism. Then came April 19th, 1993. The Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas went up in flames on live television. 76 people died, including 25 children. For most Americans, Waco was a tragedy. For For Lynda Block, it was a revelation. Everything she'd been writing about suddenly felt real. The government really would kill children. They really would burn people alive rather than back down. Her friend Gary Hunt later explained how Waco transformed people like Lynda. Before Waco, their anti-government beliefs were mostly theoretical. Angry words on paper, rebellious thoughts shared over coffee. After watching those buildings burn with families inside, theory became conviction. Conviction became rage. And for Lynda, rage would soon become action. This is when George Sibley enters the picture, her common-law husband, who would become her partner in crime. Unlike her elderly ex-husband, Carl, George shared Lynda's anti-government fury. He believed the same conspiracy theories, felt the same anger about Waco, and most dangerously, he was willing to act on those beliefs. Together, they formed an echo chamber where paranoia bounced back and forth, growing stronger with each conversation, each article, each perceived slight from the government they both despised. By the summer of 1993, the woman who once gently rescued abandoned kittens was stockpiling weapons. The library president who organized children's reading programs was writing about revolution. The transformation was almost complete. All it would take was one spark to turn Lynda Block from an activist into a killer, and that spark was about to come from the last person you'd expect, her 80-year-old ex-husband, Carl. August 1992. The paranoia that had been building inside Lynda Block finally exploded into violence. She and George Sibley didn't just break into her ex-husband Carl's home, they came with a plan. Remember, Carl was over 80 years old at this point, a veteran who thought his troubles with his ex-wife were behind him. He was wrong. During the confrontation, as Carl tried to defend himself, Lynda pulled a knife and drove it into his chest. Think about that transformation for a moment. The woman who investigated animal abuse cases, who couldn't stand to see suffering, was now creating it with her own hands. Carl survived, but barely. And instead of calling 911, instead of showing any remorse, Lynda and George grabbed her 9-year-old son and ran. They became fugitives, driving state to state, living out of their car, teaching a child that running from the law was somehow noble. That little boy in the back seat was learning that violence was acceptable, that the government was evil, that his mother stabbing an elderly man was justified. For over a year, they stayed ahead of the authorities. They used fake names, paid cash for everything, avoided anywhere with security cameras. To Lynda, this wasn't running from justice. This was resisting tyranny. Every day on the run just reinforced her belief that she was a patriot fighting against an illegitimate system. Every close call with police became another story of outsmarting the oppressors. She was writing her own narrative where she was the hero and everyone else was the enemy. Then came October 4th, 1993, a regular Monday in Opelika, Alabama. Officer Roger Motley was 38 years old, a dedicated cop doing routine patrol. When he spotted a car in the Wal-Mart parking lot with what looked like a distressed child inside, he did what any good officer would do. He went to check on the kid's welfare. That child was Lynda's son. Officer Motley had no idea he was walking toward 2 armed fugitives who believed the government was out to destroy them. Here's where the story takes a turn that still shocks investigators today. Lynda wasn't even in the car when Officer Motley approached. She was at a payphone nearby, probably making arrangements for their next hideout. George Sibley was behind the wheel, and within seconds, he opened fire on Officer Motley. The officer, caught completely off guard, tried to return fire while taking cover. That's when Lynda heard the gunshots. Now, a normal person would run away from gunfire. A mother might grab her child and flee, but Lynda Block grabbed her gun and ran toward the shooting. Witnesses watched in disbelief as this middle-aged woman charged at a police officer, firing her weapon. She wasn't defending herself, she was actively attacking. Officer Motley, already wounded from George's initial shots, was now taking fire from 2 directions. He didn't stand a chance. Multiple witnesses saw what happened next. Lynda and George didn't check if Officer Motley was alive. They didn't call for help. They jumped in their car and sped away, leaving a police officer bleeding to death in a Wal-Mart parking lot. Roger Motley died doing the simplest, most compassionate part of his job. checking on a child who might need help. He left behind a wife named Juanita and a mother who would later watch his killer's execution. The manhunt that followed was massive. Every law enforcement agency in Alabama mobilized to find these cop killers. Roadblocks went up across the state. Their photos were plastered on every news channel, and it didn't take long. Within hours, police had them surrounded on a highway, dozens of officers, weapons drawn, ready for another shootout. This is when Lynda Block said something that reveals just how detached from reality she'd become. Speaking to the police negotiator, she pleaded, "Let's not have another Waco happen here." She genuinely believed she was David Koresh. She thought the government would burn her alive like those Branch Davidians. The negotiator's response tells you everything about how bizarre this was. He had no idea what she was talking about. "What's Waco?" he asked. The biggest law enforcement disaster in recent history, the event that had been on every news channel for weeks, and this negotiator didn't even know what Waco was. It shows just how much Lynda had built up this incident in her mind, turned it into something bigger than it actually was to most people. To her, Waco was everything. To the officer trying to arrest her, it was just another day on the job. They surrendered without additional violence, but Lynda's words during the arrest were telling. She kept insisting they were sovereign citizens, that the police had no authority over them, that this was all illegal. Even with a dead cop behind her and dozens of guns pointed at her, she still believed she was the victim. The transformation was complete. The woman who once protected the innocent had murdered someone trying to protect an innocent child, and she would go to her death believing she was right.
It was thinking of my son that made us decide to surrender and fight.
She's out. She's out. She's out. She's walking to the rear.
4 hours later, Lyon and Sibley gave themselves up. Inside the Mustang, police found an arsenal of weapons, rifles, knives, pistols, and more than 1,000 rounds of ammunition.
The courtroom in Opelika, Alabama, became Lynda Block's stage for one final act of defiance. Most defendants facing the death penalty would beg for the best lawyers money could buy. Not Lynda. She fired her court-appointed attorneys and declared she would represent herself. Why? Because in her mind, the entire legal system was a fraud. Judges were actors, laws were fiction. The courtroom was a theater, and she refused to play along. During the trial, prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence. Multiple witnesses had seen her shooting at Officer Motley. Ballistics matched her gun to bullets found at the scene. Her son, her own 9-year-old boy, had been in the car during the murder, but Lynda didn't argue the facts. Instead, she argued that the court had no jurisdiction over her because she was a sovereign citizen. She actually stood before the jury and explained that the American flag in the courtroom, with its gold fringe, meant they were under maritime law, not constitutional law. The jurors stared at her like she was speaking a foreign language. The prosecution brought in Officer Motley's widow, Juanita, who testified about the last morning she saw her husband. He'd kissed her goodbye, promised to be careful, just another ordinary day that ended with her becoming a widow at 35. Lynda showed no emotion, no apology, no acknowledgement that she'd destroyed a family. When given the chance to cross-examine witnesses, she used it to lecture them about government conspiracies and constitutional theories that existed only in her mind. Here's the part that shocked even hardened court reporters. When Lynda took the stand in her own defense, she didn't deny killing Officer Motley, she justified it. She claimed he had no right to approach their car, no authority to question them, that he was an agent of an illegitimate government. She told the jury that she and George were actually the victims, that they were defending themselves against tyranny. She compared herself to the founding fathers fighting British oppression. A grandmother who shot a cop checking on a child was comparing herself to George Washington. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Guilty of capital murder. When the judge read the verdict, Lynda didn't flinch. She simply shook her head, as if the entire proceeding had confirmed everything she believed about the corrupt system. During the penalty phase, when the jury would decide between life in prison or death, prosecutors presented evidence about the stabbing of her ex-husband, Carl.
She came up behind him, knelt down in a firing position with her semi-automatic and opened fire, 15 feet. And that's what I'd call a cold-blooded killer.
They painted a picture of a woman who had chosen violence repeatedly, who showed no remorse, who posed a continuing threat to anyone who crossed her path. The defense that Lynda presented for herself was bizarre even by sovereign citizen standards. She submitted hundreds of pages of documents covered in legal-sounding gibberish, references to Admiralty law, citations of the Magna Carta, claims that Alabama had never properly rejoined the Union after the Civil War. She actually argued that because of this, Alabama couldn't legally execute anyone. The judge had to repeatedly stop her from turning the courtroom into a political rally. When the jury recommended death, Lynda seemed almost satisfied, like a martyr finally receiving her crown.
I don't regret it. I do regret that I had to take a life, and that bothers me a lot. But I don't regret that I defended my husband. And I never could understand why suddenly the law says that simply because I shoot a police officer, without considering the circumstances that led to it, could land me on death row.
She'd been given every opportunity to save her own life, accept a plea deal, show remorse, let lawyers help her. She rejected it all. She would rather die than acknowledge the legitimacy of the system that condemned her. Death row at Alabama's Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women wasn't built for someone like Lynda Block. Most condemned women break down, find religion, or spend years desperately filing appeals. Lynda did none of that. She turned her cell into an office, continuing to publish her anti-government newsletter from behind bars. She actually had subscribers sending her money orders to keep Liberatus running while she awaited execution. The prison guards didn't know what to make of her. She wasn't violent, wasn't causing trouble, but she also wasn't like any other death row inmate they'd seen. She spent her days writing articles with titles like The Illusion of Justice and Why My Execution Will Prove Me Right. She genuinely believed her death would spark some kind of revolution, that patriots across America would rise up when the government executed a grandmother for defending herself. During those 9 years, Lynda could have filed appeal after appeal. The court kept appointing lawyers for her, and she kept firing them. She refused to acknowledge that any court had the right to review her case. Even other inmates thought she was crazy. Here's a woman who could potentially save her own life with a simple appeal claiming ineffective counsel. After all, she'd represented herself, and she wouldn't do it. She'd rather die than participate in what she saw as a charade. But here's the detail that really shows how far gone she was. George Sibley, her partner in crime, was also on death row in the men's prison. He did file appeals. He even tried to claim that Lynda had fired the fatal shots, not him, hoping to save himself by throwing her under the bus. When Lynda heard about this betrayal, she didn't care. She wrote that George was weak for participating in the system, for acknowledging its authority by filing appeals. The man she'd killed for had turned on her, and she still wouldn't bend. As her execution date approached in 2002, Alabama was preparing to switch from the electric chair to lethal injection. Lynda Block would be the last person to die in Yellow Mama, the yellow wooden chair that had been used since 1927. She could have delayed her execution by requesting lethal injection, could have bought herself more time. She didn't. If the state was going to kill her, she wanted them to do it in the most dramatic, old-fashioned way possible. She wanted to be remembered. May 9th, 2002. Lynda Block woke up in her death row cell for the last time, knowing she had less than 24 hours to live. Prison protocol offered her anything she wanted for her last meal. Inmates had ordered everything from lobster to birthday cake. Lynda refused to order anything, not as a hunger strike, not as a protest, but because acknowledging the last meal tradition would mean participating in the system she despised. She would die hungry rather than accept what she saw as the state's false mercy. That afternoon, 3 friends came to visit her. Not family. Her son, now 19 years old, didn't come. Think about that. The boy who'd witnessed his mother shoot a police officer, who'd spent his childhood on the run, who'd watched both his parental figures choose death over submission. He couldn't face her one last time. These 3 friends spent hours with Lynda, later reporting that she seemed calm, almost peaceful. She talked about her beliefs, her certainty that history would vindicate her, that future generations would understand she died for freedom. The prison chaplain came by, as they do for all executions. Lynda had requested a spiritual advisor, a woman named Sally Michaud, who shared some of her anti-government beliefs. But when the time came for Sally to witness the execution, to be that last friendly face Lynda would see, Sally didn't show up. Even the one person Lynda thought understood her couldn't watch her die. In her final moments, Lynda Block would be surrounded by strangers and enemies. As midnight approached, guards came to prepare her. They shaved her head, standard procedure to ensure good electrical contact. They asked if she wanted to make a final statement, to leave any last words for the world. She refused. All those years of writing, all those articles and newsletters and courtroom speeches, and when given one last chance to speak, she chose silence. It was her final act of defiance. She wouldn't give the state the satisfaction of her words. At 11:45 p.m., they walked her to the execution chamber. Witnesses later described her demeanor as blank, emotionless. She didn't struggle, didn't cry, didn't pray aloud. She walked in wearing a white prison uniform, her shaved head making her look older than her 54 years. When she entered the chamber and saw Yellow Mama, that yellow wooden chair with its leather straps and metal electrodes, she didn't hesitate. She sat down like she was sitting in any ordinary chair. The witnesses gathered behind the glass included Officer Motley's mother and sister. His widow, Juanita, had planned to attend, but at the last moment couldn't do it. She later said she made it as far as the witness room before asking to leave. She couldn't watch another person die, even the person who'd killed her husband. That's the difference between someone like Juanita Motley and someone like Lynda Block. One could still feel mercy, even for their enemy. The guards strapped Lynda's arms and legs to the chair. They placed a metal cap on her shaved head, with a wet sponge inside to conduct electricity. Then came the black leather hood, covering her face so witnesses wouldn't see her expression when the electricity hit. At exactly 12:01 a.m. on May 10th, 2002, the warden gave the signal. 2,050 volts surged through Lynda Block's body for 20 seconds. Her body went rigid, straining against the straps. Then they reduced it to 250 volts for 100 seconds, essentially cooking her from the inside. The witnesses said there was no sound except the hum of electricity. No last words, no screams, nothing. At 12:10 a.m., a doctor checked for a pulse and pronounced her dead. The last person to ever die in Alabama's electric chair was gone. But here's the detail that haunts everyone who was there. When they removed the hood, witnesses said Lynda's eyes were still open, staring straight ahead with what one guard described as a blank stare. Even in death, she wouldn't close her eyes, wouldn't look away. She died as she lived, defiant, unblinking, and absolutely convinced she was right. Yellow Mama was immediately retired after Lynda's execution. The chair that had killed 177 people since 1927 was disconnected and moved to a storage attic above the death chamber where it sits today. Alabama switched to lethal injection, joining the rest of America in what they considered a more humane form of execution. But they kept Yellow Mama in storage, just in case some future inmate chooses electrocution. So far, no one has. 3 years later, George Sibley was executed by lethal injection. In his final statement, he claimed Lynda had fired the shots that killed Officer Motley, still trying to save himself, even so as the needle went into his arm. He died a coward, the complete opposite of the woman who'd refused to beg, refused to bend, refused to break. So how do you even begin to make sense of Lynda Block? How does a woman who once devoted herself to rescuing animals, organizing fundraisers, and helping her community end up taking the life of a police officer who was only trying to help a child? It's easy to say she lost her mind, that conspiracy theories warped her until she couldn't tell the truth from delusion, but that explanation feels too convenient. Lynda wasn't lost in a fog. She made choices, one after another, that carried her further down a road she built herself. She chose the anger. She chose the violence. She chose to believe she was right, no matter who got hurt. Maybe the saddest part isn't just that Officer Roger Motley died, it's that Lynda had the potential to do real good in this world. She had intelligence, conviction, and heart. But all of that was poisoned by fear and ideology until she became the very thing she once despised. Her story reminds us how dangerous it is to be absolutely certain you're the hero. Once you see everyone else as the enemy, anything can be justified. Lynda Block died believing she was a patriot, a martyr, someone fighting for freedom. In reality, she was a grandmother who threw away her family, her purpose, and her humanity for a belief that was never real. Officer Motley's family still visits his grave in Opelika. Lynda's burial place remains secret, hidden, quiet, like a chapter her family never once reopened. Somewhere out there, her son still lives with the memory of that day, the gunshots, the chaos, and the mother who chose ideology over love. And in that attic above Alabama's death chamber, Yellow Mama still sits, a relic of every choice that led a woman from compassion to destruction. So, what do you think? Was Lynda Block a victim of her own beliefs, or just someone who refused to face the truth? Let me know your thoughts in the comments.